Greetings all. With the release of Spearhead, the book about the gunner whose moment of fame was the destruction of a panther at the Cologne Cathedral, I thought now would be a good time to look over just how it was that Clarence's tank came to be. Much of this has already been put up in written format on the Chieftain's Hatch on the World of Tanks portal. I've got something like 8 articles up on the subject. But if you're the sort of person who prefers to listen, as opposed to read multiple articles scattered around the web, well then, this video is for you. As is well known, the US came to World War II with a partial head start. They sort of knew what was coming and had enough time to spin up the M3 medium for export and domestic use before switching to the M4, which would see them through at least the first part of the war. That said, the M4 was fundamentally a very old design. It was an outstanding design, which is why it was so viable for many years, but Ordnance Branch, the folks in charge of developing new equipment, felt it was possible to do better. These new tanks would incorporate some improvements commensurate with their later design. The new 76mm gun would be incorporated from the start, and the entire powertrain would be at the rear. Combined with an intent to only use automotive engines as opposed to aircraft radials, this would result in a lower silhouette. It was planned that these new tanks would be smaller, more mobile, and hit about as hard as both the tank destroyers and the upgraded M4s it will be replacing. Of course, it's very easy for the chap in charge of writing the design requirements to say, I want a tank which does everything better. Give it a meter of armor, a gun twice the size of anything out there, make it weigh less than 30 tons and do 45 miles an hour. If it can fly, so much the better. Actually making it happen though can be a tad more difficult. I have mentioned before that it normally takes about 2 years for a weapons program to come to fielding, at least in the World War II period. Things seem to take a bit longer today, and Pershing didn't actually fall far short of that. You need to cast your mind back to late 1942. The 76mm M4 had just been rejected by Armoured Force for being unusable. Production of the M10 tank destroyer with a 3-inch gun was in full swing. The T-67 tank destroyer was just about to be delivered for testing, and approval to produce the M6 heavy tank in limited numbers had just been granted. For comparison in the rest of the world, the British had just finished production of the Crusader III with the same 6-pounder gun as Churchill was coming with. Early Cromwell-type prototypes were coming out, such as Cavalier and Centaur. The Germans had been fielding the Panzer IV with the longer L-43 7.5 for about 6 months, and Tiger I had barely entered production. The Soviets were still building KV-1s and T-34 76s. This is far from the time of the behemoths one often thinks about in terms of World War II tank battles. During this time, Ordnance were not one to put all their eggs in one basket. A series of vehicles with generally the same layout was produced, T-23, T-20 and T-22. T-23 was perhaps the most ambitious and the darling of the R&D head, General Gladian Barnes. What made him especially proud of the vehicle was the potential of the electric drive system, such was originally created for the T1 heavy tank. This gave the potential of the tank to spin on a dime, have great torque, travel as fast in reverse as forwards, and even be completely operated by a single crewman. The pilot vehicle came out in January of 1943. It still had the Sherman-type vertical volley suspension and track though. The somewhat similar T-20 tank was ready for testing a few months later. Although it came with a somewhat more advanced horizontal volley suspension system, its big trick was a hydromatic transmission, which simplified driver training requirements. The third of the trio to show up was T-22 in June of 43. This was arguably the most conservative of the three and is best described as a redesigned M4A3. By use of the Ford engine and placing the manual transmission at the rear, the low design was permitted together with the same early HVSS system as on the T-20. This one had no future right out the gate. It has significant powertrain issues, and in any case the T-23 had already been selected for production by then. In the end, T-20 was similarly overtaken by events. Persistent trouble with the Torquematic transmission meant that it never got any further than the General Motors proving ground, and back to the factory for repairs. Aberdeen finally got a hold of theirs in early 1944, by which time there were definitely more promising options. Again, that more promising option was the T-23. In April of 43, the brass were given a demonstration of the tank's capability. Fortunately for Ordnance, it worked well, and the brass were sufficiently impressed, especially in contrast with the ill-fated M7 medium tank, which was starting its death throes before finally being put to mercy later that year. The all-singing, all-dancing T-23, it was agreed, would start with an initial production run of 250 tanks. Of course, as we now know from history, things did not go overly well. Back on the T-20 track, in July of 1943, the first T-20E3 arrived, which was a T-20 with torsion bar suspension as opposed to bogies. A logical progression, given the experience of the suspension type with the T-70 gun motor carriage, which we now know as the M18 Hellcat. This was a suspension which Ordnance really wanted to put on the T-23 tank, and indeed that the M27 designation was going to be assigned to the torsion bar version of the T-23. However, the desire to get the tank into production sooner was such that there was no time for the T-20E3 to be tested first. Thus, the T-23s entered production with the late VVSS suspension system, which presumably proved to be a bit more reliable than the early HVSS found on T-20, or it wouldn't have been used. That was only a minor detail, however, compared to the real problem: the electric transmission. The theoretical benefits were manifest, and Barnes saw as much potential in the system as his fellow mad scientist over in Germany, Ferdinand Porsche, did. Those benefits did not, however, come without significant snags, such as an extra 3.5 tons of weight at the rear of the tank. This was eventually somewhat counterbalanced by increasing the frontal armour thickness another ½ inch to 3 inches, but again that didn't make the combat engineers or the logisticians who were responsible for getting it where it needed to go any happier. Neither were Armoured Force impressed by the resultant ground pressure, but even those issues could perhaps be tolerated if the system were something approaching reliable and if it didn't require highly trained mechanics to repair. Armoured Force were, to put it bluntly, not satisfied. In the meantime, they had a decision to make. The next year was shaping up to be the make-or-break year of the war. What would be the vehicle that they would choose to be equipped with in sufficient numbers to take the war to Germany on the European continent? Ordnance was promising that the T-23's issues would be fixed. On the other hand, the M4 was doing plenty well enough and needed only tweaks. With this decision, Armoured Force in particular, and Army Ground Forces in general, could arguably be gambling over the future of the planet. For its various flaws, the M4 it would be. There really couldn't be any decision other way. I mean, what if Ordnance were wrong about its ability to get the T-23 running to standard? And that was far from the only matter, of course. All the current vehicles in development or under serious consideration used the 76mm gun. The T-20 series, the improved M4, the M18 tank destroyer. There was the occasional experimental dalliance with the 90mm, such as on the M6 heavy tank or the T-53 tank destroyer. But none of the using arms wanted it. Even tank destroyer branch held a position in opposition to the 90mm gun motor carriage T-71, which would be the M36 Jackson, for most of 1943. Together with Armoured Force, they believed that the 76mm or 3-inch gun was plenty enough to do the job. Now one might ask the question, well, why not just put the bigger gun in anyway, just in case you need it? And the answer is because it's not that simple. A bigger gun comes with liabilities, such as a lower rate of fire and, more importantly, ammunition capacity. As late as April of 1944, the European Theatre of Operations was insisting that any vehicles going its direction carried at least 70 rounds of ammunition. It was so important to the local commanders, and the M476 could carry this, not least because of the high sponsons, but the T-23 production variant had an ammunition capacity of only 66 rounds, which I guess could at least be considered close enough. The US had a reliable, accurate gun, believed, granted incorrectly as it turned out, to be powerful enough to do the job. It can engage multiple targets quickly, and if it turned out that more punch was deemed necessary, an improvement in velocity would do the job, HVAP ammo. For whatever reason, this latter solution is not implemented until July of 1944, but that's not really a factor in the thinking of the time. When the pilot 90mm tank T-26E1 was produced, ammunition capacity for the larger round was, and you're not going to like this, 42. Utterly unacceptable for vehicles supposed to conduct sustained operations. And of course there is the matter of what there was to shoot at. Tiger 1 had been encountered by US forces about 6 months earlier. Definitely something to respect, but not unkillable, even with 75mm guns, although it took a bit of work. The 3-inch 76mm would do better. Panther had not yet been discovered. It had not yet been deployed by the time the US decided, just in case, to develop a 90mm gun tank. This was a modification to the order for the 250 T-23s, as now there would only be 200 T-23s of the order built, the other 50 of which will be 90mm tanks. 40 of them will be T-23s with the 90mm guns, the remaining 10 will be of a heavier type with more armour. Cue the entry of several different designs of this 90mm tank. One of the first decisions made was that the T-25 and T-26 were not going to cut it with the electric motors. The tanks were already heavy enough, no point in adding to the track ground pressure and transportation tail, even if they could be gotten to work well. Thus, the T-25E1 and T-26E1 were the two vehicles which would receive the bulk of the attention. Filled as ever with utter faith in their ability to produce serviceable vehicles, by October 43 ordnance were suggesting building 500 each of the T-25 and T-26 series tanks so that the lines would be set up for mass production. Not surprisingly, this was shot down. The US had spent too much capital and effort setting up for armoured vehicles which turned out to be red herrings. The M7 Medium was a perfect case in point. Besides, the whole point of building both the T-25 and T-26 was to see which was better. Why build production lines for two vehicles when one of the two would do? Something of a four-sided battle then started between the proponents and the objectors to the T-25 and T-26 series tanks. These sides are Army Ground Forces, including Armoured Board. Those two organizations eventually settled their differences in 1943, and as Armoured Board was subordinate to AGF, they provided basically a unified front to everybody else. Commander, European Theatre of Operations, who was now General Devers, formerly the Chief of Armour. Commander, North African Theatre of Operations, Eisenhower. And Ordnance Branch. Despite originally being somewhat against the T-26, Devers changed his tune by November of 43, asking for 250 of the 90mm tanks, the idea basically being to issue one T-26 for every 5 M4s. Ordnance, of course, gave this request wholehearted approval, but instead of taking what they had, they went for overreach and also recommended, while we're at it, let's build 1,000 T-23s. Army Ground Forces weren't so sure about this, but they sent their request around for opinions. Two results came back. Firstly, from Ground Requirements saying, hang on, we haven't even built one for testing yet, we don't know if it'll work. Ordering 250 is rather putting the cart before the horse. Similarly, the Corps of Engineers came back saying, we don't have enough bridges which will take the weight of this new thing. We won't guarantee you'll be able to get the tank where you want it to go. Eisenhower chipped in as well, and unlike Devers, he was the one actually engaged in fighting the Germans at the time. He did not want the 40-plus ton beasts, he thought they were too heavy and sacrificed too much mobility. McNair looked at the evidence in front of him. His procurement guys were recommending against building untested equipment. His engineers were recommending against building equipment that they couldn't guarantee would be where it needed to be. His transatlantic combat commander was recommending against sending the proposed equipment, and of course the guys in the Pacific had no problems with the M4 at all. The equipment that they had in the field seemed to be doing well enough against the Germans in Italy, and the new variant M4 with the wider tracks and high velocity gun would remedy the obvious limitations of the tank, and they knew it worked, and the engineers could handle it. On the other hand, the guy not actively involved in fighting yet wanted the bigger tank, and those snake oil salesmen over in Ordnance were pushing anything at all that was new and shiny. McNair has gotten a lot of flack over the succeeding years for his decision to not immediately proceed with full production of T-26. Given the available information, though, that he had, what rational reason would there have been to decide otherwise? He did, however, recommend continuing the T-25 and T-26 programs as a developmental type. This situation lasted about a month. Two things happened in December. Firstly, Devers again repeated his request for the 90mm tanks. Secondly, Army Service Forces, the department under which Ordnance fell, took this opportunity to go over McNair's head and made their case to the War Department. The War Department authorized production of 250 T-26E1 tanks as a result. This was not communicated directly to Army Ground Forces, and when General Dean, the head of Requirements Division, discovered this, he was a bit put out and asked McNair to fight it, listing out the large litany of exceptions that he took to the proposal. McNair refused, saying that the arguments had been made before, the decision had been made by higher authority, and he would send Devers his 250 tanks. So in January of 1944, it was committed that mass production of the T-26 series of tanks would start. This was something of a gamble as the prototype had not yet been delivered. The schedule was drawn up, and it would be that the last of the 250 would roll off the production line in April of 45. The schedule would prove to be more or less met. By way of comparison, one can look at the turnaround time for the 76mm M4. Once the decision to build the tank had been made in September of 1943, physical production would have started in mid-January of 44, and the tanks actually started arriving in the UK in early May. So, decision to in the field is about 8 months. And this is with a tank which was really just a modification of something already in service in which it completed testing. To apply the same timeline to Pershing, the soonest that this could have possibly happen would be August. Maybe June if the original date from Devers is used. And this was of a tank which had not yet been tested. Shortly after this decision was made, the first two T-25 series actually showed up. The first was a T-25E1 built to specification, the second was quite literally a T-23 modified with a 90mm gun and a horizontal volley suspension system. Come February, the first T-26E1s start arriving. They start arriving and there is something of a litany of problems. The official position of Armoured Force is that the vehicle was not battle-worthy. There were repeated pressings by Ordnance Branch to send the vehicles to Italy or Europe for field testing, but Army Ground Forces was having none of it. Their combat soldiers would not be guinea pigs for untested equipment, and the combat zone was not, to their mind, an approved testing agency. Initially, Army Ground Forces preferred the T-25. Indeed, not only did they prefer the T-25, they wanted to give it the T-26's wider tracks, and again drop it down to the 76mm gun. This, they thought, would provide the best overall mix of improved capability due to its new design and technologies, whilst retaining the advantages of mobility, gun handling and ammunition capacity of the lighter tank with the smaller gun. However, Ordnance felt they didn't have the manpower available to devote to this third option, and eventually opinions started to come back from Europe that if the new tanks were going to go dueling German vehicles, they probably needed more armour anyway. So the T-25 started to fall by the wayside. Not that all was great for the T-26. Some changes were obscure but still important, such as changing the steering ratio. It was too tight, resulting in reliability and power issues. Others were very obvious, such as cooling issues and problems with the powertrain falling apart. The original wet stowage with which the vehicles came had to be dispensed with. If they wanted to carry a reasonable amount of ammunition, well, the safety equipment had to go. So too did the turret basket. In the opinion of Ordnance, the required 70 or maybe even 71 rounds could be obtained if all other requirements were subordinated to it. Stowage would have to be sacrificed or moved. The turret would become crowded and access to the driver's position from the turret was limited. 18 rounds could have been placed if the bow gunner were removed, but the ETO was having none of that. They wanted the bow machine gun. Ordnance would have rather dispensed with him and the weak point in the bow armour, but customer is always right. And considering I didn't actually find Pershing to be too bad inside in my Inside the Hatch video, Ordnance actually did make a fairly reasonable job of it. Of course, Ordnance looked at the list of problems with the tanks that had been sent back to them and started coming up with their solutions. This would require sufficient change that the new model would be redesignated as a T-26E3. The E2 was a variant with a 105mm howitzer, later built as the M45. To test these new solutions out, they took a spare T-25E1 they had lying around and converted it. By this point, we're talking about the summer of 1944, and in addition to the conversion, they still had to test it. Conversion made and testing completed, the changes were approved for the production line, and T-26E3 entered full-rate initial production in November of 1944. After several more attempts by Ordnance to get the vehicle tested in the field, a position I can't seem to recall was held with any other major end item, they finally got approval on the 24th of November to send 20 vehicles overseas from the first production batch. Again, Army ground forces weren't thrilled, but were overruled. Thus it was that of the first 40 vehicles off the line, 20 were sent to Aberdeen and Fort Knox for testing, and at the same time 20 were sent for Europe, eventually arriving in Amsterdam the second week of February. Some tank transporters had to be modified to carry the tanks, and then they were sent to Aachen for issuance. Bradley had decided, for whatever reason, that the 3rd and 9th Armoured Divisions would get 10 tanks each. It was to local discretion how they would be split up, so 14th Tank Battalion decided to put all 5 of its tanks into a single platoon. They got involved in a Remagen fight, although they were left behind for a few days due to being too heavy to get across the bridge. 19th Tank Battalion gave theirs 1 to A Company, 2 each to B and C. Over in 3rd Armoured, they split the love. 33rd Armoured Regiment had 1 each sent to D, E, F, H and I companies, whilst Clarence's 32nd put 1 each into D, E, G, H and I companies. They didn't take long to get into the fight. Ready for service by the 20th of February, the first loss came on the 26th when a Tiger I put 3 rounds into a Pershing named Fireball. The town of Elsdorf was one of the rare occasions that the US Army in Western Europe actually met a Tiger I. The Tiger then turned it into a Pyrrhic victory when, during its escape afterwards, it got itself stuck and had to be abandoned. 2 days later, another Pershing killed a Tiger and 2 Panzer IVs. Another Pershing ended up knocked out after taking 2 rounds from artillery. It was repairable, but it took several weeks to do it. Adding to the woes, within 2 weeks, 2 tanks lost their engines, and somehow a 3rd tank had a connecting rod go astray in the crankcase of its auxiliary motor. Another Pershing was knocked out by a Nashorn, resulting in an ammunition blow. It was not deemed worth repairing. The Super Pershing showed up in mid-March. The gun sight couldn't be found, and neither could the ammunition. It turned out that the experimental ammunition had accidentally been sent to the 635th Tank Destroyer Battalion, who were trying to figure out why the 90mm ammunition did not fit in their towed 90mm guns. At this point, production taps had been turned on, and the next 40 T-26s arrived in late March, going to 2nd and 5th Armoured. The new crews got all of 45 minutes of instruction before being sent forward. No practical exercise. In total, some 200 T-26s were issued to tank crews by war's end, with varying degrees of success and familiarity. There is a side note, as 12 Pershings were sent to the Pacific Theatre. There were a number of delays, not least because it was discovered after they got to theatre that most of the LCTs couldn't take the tank. The war ended before they could see combat. Of course, it was only the beginning of the M26 story. It continued through until the Korean War, before the improved M46 with the new Continental V12 and cross-drive transmission, which remedied much of the M26's failings, showed up. So there you go. This is basically the story of how Clarence's M26 showed up for him to use in Aachen. See you next time.